Hi, everyone. Thank you for being with us. This is our Sexual Assault 101 presentation in honor of Sexual Assault Awareness Month 2021. And I'm here with my coworker, Sabrina. My name is Nicole. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Prevention Education Specialist with Waymakers Sexual Assault Victim Services and Prevention. And
Awesome.
Sabrina?
And like Nicole said, I'm Sabrina. Also, my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am the prevention coordinator for our program. And I'm so excited to be able to have this little discussion today about just the basics of sexual assault, right? You know, we're doing another SAM virtually. And so we wanted to provide just a general workshop that anyone could access and just learn the absolute basics of what the issue that we are gathering around this month and bringing more awareness to.
Yeah, absolutely. So well said. And just a little bit about who we work for. Waymakers is a nonprofit that works in Orange County, California. We build safer communities by helping individuals make their way through conflict and crisis to a place of strength and stability.
And the part of Waymakers that we specifically work for is Sexual Assault Victim Services, and we serve as Orange County's only rape crisis center. So our goal is to help as many folks as possible who have been impacted by sexual assault and abuse. All of our services are free and confidential with survivors over the age of 12 and older. Primarily, our services are offered in English and Spanish, but we're able to accommodate other languages as needed. We've got a great volunteer pool with a bunch of people who speak a couple different languages. We're able to use Language Line. Our goal is to help as many folks as possible, right? So we service survivors, whether or not they reported to law enforcement, regardless of how long ago an assault occurred. You know, we have services where we have volunteers and advocates that are supporting survivors who are, at the hospital right after an assault has happened. And we also have clients that maybe the assault happened 30 plus years ago and they're looking for emotional support. We're glad to provide that. We also work with survivors regardless of any other outstanding mental health concerns, whether or not someone has been in a detention center or has a criminal history. Like I said, we really try and help as many folks as possible get resources, get that emotional support, and do a lot of that short-term crisis counseling and get referrals to longer-term services that can help with someone's healing journey.
Absolutely. And to go along with those services, Waymakers, we have a hotline for Orange County's 24 hours. It's free, it's confidential. Either of those phone numbers that you see listed there will take you to our hotline. And then we understand that sometimes people might not feel very comfortable talking on the phone. So we wanted to add that RAIN, which is our national sexual assault hotline or chat line, is also available. So if you go to RAIN with 2Ns.org, you'll see on the upper right-hand tab that there's an ability to chat. And so if anybody would like to chat instead, that's available as well. And you will see that we have a link to a handout on the caption of this video. And that link will send you to our really helpful resource guide. It's got, brochures describing what Sabrina had just said about our services, how they're offered, when they're offered, any sort of changes that we've had to do during the pandemic, and also some really helpful documents that we will be referring to throughout the presentation that you can go to, read on your own time, maybe share with others, download, print, whatever you'd like to do so that you can have something handy to take home or have at home with you after this presentation ends.
That is the beauty of virtual, right? Is they don't got to take anything home. You're at home.
Nope,
probably.
You are at home.
No trees were killed in the making of this presentation.
I love that.
And also wanted to point out, right, Nicole and I were going to be having this conversation about sexual assault, and especially because we're not in the room with you, we can't tell necessarily if there's going to be some emotional overwhelm. And so really just want to remind y'all to take care of yourselves. Feel free to click out of the presentation, take breaks. Also in that handouts link, there are 2 documents. One of them has a bunch of different crisis lines that can be accessed for a variety of different populations and different forms of violence. And then there's another document that has different emotional regulation tools. So whether while you're listening, after, if you need some grounding techniques or anything else to kind of take care of yourself throughout and after this presentation, that's also available to you. So please don't hesitate to access those. We will not be offended. We will have no idea whether or not you stop watching. So feel free to do whatever you need, right? This month is about you, and however you want to engage in SAM is totally fine. So to kind of get us started in our conversation, as Nicole and I said, we both focus on the prevention of sexual assault. And a lot of times there are misconceptions about what exactly this means. So Nicole, I wanted to ask you, when you were growing up or like when you went to college, how did you learn about sexual assault prevention? What were kind of the safety tips that maybe were taught to you?
Oh, I remember them very clearly. My sister and I, we had to take the bus home and walk home, just a couple of blocks. But I remember my parents, putting us aside, pulling us aside and telling us, make sure you don't talk to strangers, make sure that make sure that nobody's following you, don't walk home by yourself, don't have your headphones in, when iPods came out a little bit later, don't have, always have one eye open, especially at night, especially when you're walking to your car at night, have your keys in between your fingers, everything was based upon the fact that sexual assault was inevitable. There will be people out there trying to hurt me and my sister, and it is up to us to be able to defend ourselves, whether that means, not drinking, being aware of our surroundings, having pepper spray or those handy dandy little things that you'll see on the bottom left right there. I actually was given one of those by an uncle to defend myself. So everything here checks the boxes as to things that I was told and how to prevent myself from getting assaulted.
Right, absolutely. I had lots of similar experiences, and I remember too, like when I was in college, I was really involved in our our care office, so the Campus Assault Resources and Education Office, and I was doing some like tabling at freshman orientation. And I remember either the parents would completely walk by my booth and not make eye contact with me, or they would talk about how they had gotten their kiddo some pepper spray and they were all ready to go for the school year. And I'm like, oh, okay, well that's not quite what we're talking about when it comes to sexual assault prevention, right?
Right.
But I think it really kind of harps on a lot of misconceptions about sexual assault, which we're going to be talking about, kind of myths and misconceptions throughout the training, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about these certain things, the way I like to think about it is when you are giving someone pepper spray, when you're telling them to watch their drink at a party, if you really think about it, you're not actually preventing a sexual assault, right? It's like Nicole was saying, what the parent is really saying is make sure it doesn't happen to you and your sister, right?
Mhm.
So that's not really preventing a sexual assault. It's just changing who the victim is going to be, right? Make sure the rapist doesn't get you, make sure they get someone else who was less careful, quote unquote. So
Yes.
when we talk about sexual assault prevention, right, what we're really focusing on is educating people, telling them about consent, breaking a lot of those gender norms, and breaking down a lot of the inequity in society that we see to try and let people know the reality of the issue. And that is how we focus on prevention, right? Because we know the only way to really prevent sexual assault is to stop perpetration of it, right? And so super important to keep in mind and to keep that at the forefront of our minds as we're moving through this presentation.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, we talked about, how do we learn about preventing sexual assault? And one of the first things we want to break down is what is actually considered sexual assault. Sometimes we hear the word sexual violence. Sometimes we hear the word sexual assault, sexual harassment. And, these words are not interchangeable. They all do mean different things. And sometimes it's just a matter of breaking down what constitutes sexual assault, what constitutes sexual harassment. That way we can understand, what we're seeing, what's maybe happening, and being able to define it and know that what our rights are and what was right and wrong. I feel like a really good base to start. So what is considered sexual assault? Sabrina has this really wonderful word cloud here about breaking down sexual assault. So if you can help me out just a little bit here.
It's
Yeah.
my very confusing spider web. I'm not confusing. I think maybe overwhelming is maybe the right word, but
We'll break it down.
but I think, yeah, we'll break it down. And I think it really speaks to what you were talking about, Nicole, in that there are a lot of terms that are involved. And I think in order to get a real scope of the issue, we have to really be breaking down all of these issues. So you'll see in the middle there we've got the orange circle. And so that is sexual violence. And at least when I use the term sexual violence, I kind of use it as an umbrella term to define all of these different crimes and violations that we see under that umbrella. And I kind of would group the forms of sexual violence into 4 categories, those being sexual harassment, sex trafficking, exploitation, child sexual abuse, and sexual assault. So when we talk about sexual harassment, this is basically unwanted sexual behavior that creates a hostile environment, and it can look really different, as you see with the many dots, right? There can be situations where it's verbal, like catcalling. Someone's walking down the street and another person whistles at them or yells something inappropriate, comments on their body. It can be something that's written or something that happens over social media. Maybe something like this can even mean like pictures, for example, with non-consensual pornography, something that unfortunately I think we're seeing more and more, and especially with the pandemic, a lot of couples are maybe getting intimate virtually, right? So that might involve one partner sending intimate photos to their partner. And unfortunately, what we'll sometimes see is that then that partner will violate that person's trust and either send their nudes to other friends or they're posted online somewhere. And so it's important to understand that that is a form of sexual harassment, sometimes called revenge porn. But totally not okay, right?
Or I have a question for you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, I had a question just for some people might not understand, when it does come to sharing photos, like, do we need to have permission before we send or receive photos? And I just would like you to maybe touch on that a little bit about the fact that, even if you are in a relationship, there does need to be that permissions beforehand. If not, it can be considered sexual harassment. Excuse me.
Absolutely, right? So thank you for bringing that up too. If we are sending our nudes to someone without their permission, that is also sexual harassment, right? Because we ultimately, the idea behind sending nudes or sending intimate photos, right, is it's supposed to be a pleasurable experience within the couple, right? But if someone is not getting permission to be doing that, think about the other person opening that photo. They might feel disgusted, they might feel uncomfortable, they might feel violated. And so we definitely want to make sure that the person on the receiving end of the photos wants to be receiving that, because you're totally right, that also would be sexual harassment. And unfortunately, this is something that we see on dating apps all the time, right? Is that, you'll be messaging with someone you like kind of know, and then all of a sudden they send a picture of their genitals or something, and you're like, whoa, that's not at all where we were going, right?
Didn't want that, didn't ask. Yeah.
Right. So you're totally right. That is another form of sexual harassment that we particularly see online. And then the last bit I wanted to talk about was sexual harassment can also be physical, even if it's not someone straight up grabbing an intimate body part, it could be something like I, for example, when I was in high school, I worked at a restaurant, and one of the managers that worked there, he would always touch me on my lower back, and I was 16 at the time, and he was like in his 40s. And so he would always like put his hand on my lower back, and he would tell me how beautiful I was and how I didn't even need makeup. And it always made me feel really uncomfortable, right? So that would be a situation where there was sexual harassment happening, right? Even though, my breasts weren't being touched, or, my butt wasn't being grabbed, but, that was that inappropriate touching gave me that like heebie-jeebie vibe. That would be sexual harassment, especially because that's a manager, right? It's someone who's in a position of authority, someone who's significantly older. So, for me, my first job in high school, 16 years old at this restaurant, I didn't know what to do. And that like freeze that I felt definitely is so commonly felt by people who are experiencing this type of violation, this feeling of like, I don't know what to do, but definitely that was not okay.
Yeah. Right? So it doesn't matter where it is. If it makes you feel uncomfortable, if that person didn't ask to touch you, anywhere on your body. And if it doesn't make you feel comfortable, that would be sexual harassment. That's good to know.
Absolutely. And I think too, going back to that age difference too, even if that 40-year-old who was my manager was asking, can I touch you there? Right. That's still not okay. Right. Still creepy. Still creepy. He was a special breed, but he did end up getting fired. So that was the highlight. So that's about sexual harassment. We also do, obviously, during this month of SAM, focused on sexual assault. So sexual assault basically is defined as any sexual act that happens without consent, so without permission of the other person. And this can look like a variety of things. Sexual battery would be what I was alluding to, where someone's genitals or butt or breasts are grabbed without their consent. We also, under this umbrella, we see the crime of rape, which basically is any type of forced vaginal, oral, or anal sex. That would be under the umbrella of sexual assault as well. We also do see cases within our Rape Crisis Center of child sexual abuse. These are typically cases where the victim is under the age of 14, And child sexual abuse can look like a lot of different things. You know, it can be unwanted touching, it can be, unfortunately, penetrative sex, but this can also be something like exposing a child to pornography, or you know, talking with a child about inappropriate sexual matters, maybe texting them inappropriate things, sending them photos. So even if it's not physical, there can still be child sexual abuse there.
Absolutely good to know. It does not need to be touch, anything inappropriate, showing them, talking to them about it. Good to know.
Absolutely. And finally, we have sex trafficking and exploitation. So this is, I feel like human trafficking is its whole separate issue, and there's a lot going on there, but obviously it intersects with sexual violence in that in cases of sex trafficking, this is basically a form of slavery or exploitation where someone is forced to engage in sexual acts so that typically someone else can make money. And so that person is being forced to engage in sexual behavior, usually through force, fraud, and coercion. And so that obviously is a form of sexual violence, even if we're not going to be talking about it as much in this presentation because it is just the 101. It's really important to understand that that is a part of this issue. And unfortunately, sex trafficking and human trafficking in general is a billion-dollar industry that unfortunately has just gotten more and more popular, unfortunately, during the pandemic.
Yeah. Excuse me. So something important to know about sexual assault, now that we understand, how wide ranging it can be, is that there is this misconception that sexual assault is about sexual desire, that this person is harassing this other person or flashing them or or asking them out over and over again because they are, physically attracted to them. And, that person must be good looking and they have to be young and they have to, all these things that we just assume because maybe we see that in media pretty often. But at the base of it all, sexual assault, sexual harassment is not about sexual desire. It's about power and control. It's about that person wanting to have what they want, right? And not necessarily listening to the wants and needs of the other person, whether that be their partner, whether that be a stranger, whether that be a coworker. So at the base of it all, it really is about power and control. That is the driving force behind sexual violence, I guess, was what Sabrina was saying, that's nice, our nice umbrella term there. It is it's about power and control. And I'm so sorry, excuse me. And so it can happen to anyone. So I want us to also kind of touch on that myth as well, is that it really can happen to anybody, regardless of their age, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, religion, race. Unfortunately, sexual violence does not discriminate.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up too, because I think when people misunderstand this, that's often where the victim blaming question of well, what were you wearing comes from. It's this idea of oh, well, if you were dressed sexy, then somehow you should have expected something to happen. But you're totally right. That makes literally no sense, because sexual assault, it's not about overwhelming sexual desire because someone was wearing a bikini, right? It's about that power and control. And so I think that's a really important point that people need to understand, right? It's not just something that happens to quote unquote conventionally attractive people. It is an act of violence, exactly like you were saying, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we see actually that there are disproportionate rates of violence for groups and marginalized individuals in our society who have less power in our society. So we see that overwhelmingly women are victims of sexual assault, as well as those who are perceived to be feminine, right? Even if someone doesn't identify as a woman, if there is even a man who is, expressing more feminine traits, that can be a cause of bullying or sexual harassment among that person's peers, right? So even the association that you are like a woman can make you more at a risk of experiencing this type of violence. We also see that LGBTQ individuals, BIPOC individuals, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color are more likely to be experiencing sexual assault and sexual violence. Those who are experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity, as well as children's, elders, and people with disabilities, right? And a lot of this really comes down to vulnerability, right? For example, if someone is a child, they might not be aware that they're allowed to say no. They might be afraid of what happens if they come forward. They might not be able to physically fight back. And so then that therefore makes them more vulnerable to a perpetrator who is looking for that vulnerability to exploit, right?
Yeah, that power and that control. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so that's why we really see these disproportionate rates of violence, because due to the societal marginalization and the societal disempowerment, it puts someone at a higher vulnerability for perpetrators to be able to exploit. And someone might even experience barriers to coming forward, maybe a distrust of the police or medical professionals. And so that can make it even harder for a survivor to come forward, therefore making them a more vulnerable person to exploit, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to take a look at some statistics to show you a little bit more about the scope of this problem of sexual violence. And so if you see here on the top, we have 50%, 58% of women, so nearly 3 in 5, have reported physically aggressive sexual harassment in their lifetimes. So that unwelcome touch that Sabrina had touched on earlier, showing somebody, somebody flashing, showing genitals to another person without their consent. So 3 out of 5 for women. And 1 out of 4 is that same statistic for men, where they have been physically aggressive. So we haven't really touched on this very much, but I have heard, Sabrina and I go out into the community quite often to talk about this. And there is this presumption, right? There's this assumption that this is a women's problem. Like only women are sexually harassed, only women get flashed. But as you can see here, yes, it does happen more often to women, but this is definitely not something that only happens to cisgender women. This happens to men, this happens to people of all types of genders. And we'll see that as we progress through these statistics here.
Thanks for sharing that. As we can see, for just forced sexual activity ever in their lifetimes, about 23% of women, nearly 1 in 4, have experienced this, and about 9% of men, so about 1 in 10, have experienced forced sexual activity ever in their lifetime. So thank you, Nicole, for pointing that out, right? Just because there are communities that experience disproportionate rates of violence, as we've talked about, it doesn't discriminate also. Anyone can be a victim, anyone can commit sexual assault, sexual harassment. And so it's important to bring voice to these statistics as well.
And before you go to the next slide, I just felt like sharing something. You know how we see here, it says forced sexual activity. Mm-hmm. Any sort of forced sexual activity, like Sabrina had mentioned, it could be anal, oral, or vaginal, right? And so another word for that would be rape, right? So 1 in 10, 9% of men have been raped, 23% of women have been raped, because we don't usually think about oral sex, let's say, as being, if that is forced upon somebody, as being rape, and it very much is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And to touch on, one of those marginalized communities, it would be the transgender community. So if we see here, studies estimate that between 40 and 66%, so one of the highest rates that we see here, 2 to 3.5 out of 5 of transgender individuals have been victims of sexual assault or sexual abuse in their lifetimes.
Right. So as we can see, as Nicole was saying, the more marginalized someone is, the higher those rates are, right? A little less than half to a little over half is absolutely unacceptable and horrific, right?
Absolutely.
So it's important that we talk about, what does a healthy sexual experience look like? We've been talking about those forcible sexual acts. And I did want to mention on too, something that I love that Nicole always mentions in her presentations is when we say the word force, we're not just talking about physical force, right? This can involve emotional manipulation, this can involve threats, this can involve, intimidation. It's not just that physical force. Actually, much more often, it's going to be that emotional force or that intimidation. So an important thing to bring home as well.
Yeah, and maybe we can give them an example. Maybe between 2 partners, one partner telling the other, "Well, if you loved me, you would do this for me," right? That doesn't overtly sound like this very forceful thing, but if this other partner on the other side is thinking to themselves, well, I mean, if my partner doesn't think I love them, or if they think I want to break up with them, then maybe I'll have to do this, right? So it's just that emotional manipulation that Sabrina was talking about that we see more often in real life situations.
Absolutely, right. So what does a healthy sexual experience
Yeah.
look like on the other side of this?
Yeah.
So we really like to utilize Make Your Move Missoula. They are an organization in Montana. That's where Missoula is, right? I think. And they have this wonderful kind of 4 categories for what a healthy sexual experience looks like. We've adapted one of their handouts, and it's in the Handout Savs bit.ly link folder, Google folder that we provided to you all at the beginning, and is also in the caption. And basically it's just what makes a healthy sexual experience. And their 4 categories are: do they agree? Do they want to? Is it ethical? And is it fun? So starting with, do they agree? These are kind of the bare minimums of consent, right? You know, both people are over the appropriate age. So in California, the age of consent is 18. Both people understand what they're consenting to. They agree to what is going to be going on before the next activity. No one is impaired by drugs or alcohol. And as we mentioned, there's no type of force, threat, or intimidation that's going to be used. But that is kind of the bare minimum, right? So the next category is, do they want to? You know, are both people making the space for the other one to be able to say no? Are the 2 people communicating about their boundaries? 3, is it ethical? You know, it's important to consider things like, are there any power imbalances at play? For example, if 2 people in a relationship, one person has a physical disability and the other one doesn't, you know, what accommodations are being made so that the person with the disability still feels comfortable, still feels like they can voice what they're feeling, right? You know, we don't want someone to be made like they have to go along with something, or that they're unable to get out of a situation they're uncomfortable with.
Absolutely.
Ethical also means having conversations about STIs, about potential contraception or pregnancy prevention, if that's something that the 2 people is important to them. So having all of those kind of upfront conversations, also even too about like, what is the context of this sexual experience, maybe, right? You know, is it a hookup? Is this a one-night stand? Is this the start of a relationship? You know, that's really what we mean when we talk about, is this ethical? Is this something that both people feel good about doing? And then finally, is it fun, right? You know, the point of sex is it's supposed to be a pleasurable experience. So are both people, or all the people involved, is their sexuality honored in the same way? Is the pleasure of both of them equally important? Are both people able to express themselves without fear of judgment? And so these are really the 4 components of what a healthy sexual experience looks like, what we ideally want for all people to have, right?
Yeah. And we can go a little bit more into depth about what Sabrina just mentioned. So that idea, like, do they want to, right? And so this first bullet, discussing boundaries beforehand. And so Sabrina had mentioned, you know, discussing boundaries, making sure that we're aware of what our partner is comfortable and not comfortable with, right? And we tend to talk about boundaries in the heat of the moment, right? Somebody starts to hook up with somebody else, and then it's, you know, oh, are you comfortable doing this, or do you want to do that, right? But what I always tell students that we talk to throughout the year is that it would be even better if we discuss boundaries beforehand. If you talked about them while you're out on a date, while you're hanging out, tell them, you know, what it is that you're comfortable with, what you had experience with maybe already, what's on the table, right, to try, or what's something completely that's off the table. And that makes it a little bit easier to really be open about what you are open to and not open to, because in the heat of the moment, there might be this pressure to give in to whatever it is that seems to be coming up next, right? Or maybe it's not even, it won't be that pressure, but it's just that idea of, this is all happening really fast, and I really haven't had a chance to process whether this is something that I want to do, right? And we don't want anybody to walk away from a sexual experience feeling, you know, negative about it, whether it's just like, oh, I guess I really didn't think I was ready for that, and I did it, so now I have to deal with it, right? We really want everybody to walk away with, you know, it being like, that was great, so happy I talked about that with my partner beforehand, so happy this happened, right? And so discussing them before engaging in some sexual activity would be ideal. And next, we have that idea that consent is an ongoing conversation. So this basically means that just because you've done something in the past with someone does not mean that it is that is open every single time going after that, right? So you say you're starting a relationship with someone, you know, you start to make out with them, you know, it goes forward. You we have to understand that at sometimes, our partner might have been okay with something last week, and then this time they just really don't feel like doing that. And so just not thinking like, okay, so we've already said yes to this activity, so that means that we can do this activity every time, right? It's ongoing, it changes with our mood. And people, I know, Sabrina, you probably feel the same way, but we go, well, do I really have to ask every time? And yeah, you do, because the circumstances will be different. And so just understanding that yes to a kiss is not yes to taking off somebody's clothes, and yes to taking off somebody's clothes is not yes to sex. They are all very different, distinct steps, and we have to make sure that we get consent for each of those as we go on.
Absolutely. And I think the longer you're in a relationship too, like the more you'll also get to know your partner, get to know their nonverbals, and it'll get more and more seamless as you go on, So it's like 3 years in, you don't have to necessarily ask after every step, because you're going to get to know your partner and what their boundaries are and what they're comfortable. But it's so important to continue to pay attention, right? And not just assume that, oh, well, we've done this for X amount of time, so therefore it's always going to be on the table.
And when you do ask your partner, it's important not to add your own agenda, not to add in what you want, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples. Asking somebody like, hey, do you want to come over to my place? I have a place to myself, we can, whatever it is. So like, if you want somebody, just ask somebody like, hey, do you want to come over to my place? I'm going to have it to myself. And adding your own agenda would be, hey, do you want to come over to my place? I have it to myself. I'd really like it if you came over. I think it'd be fun, but you just let me know what you think, right? Sabrina, which one would be easier to say no to? If you did feel uncomfortable going, which one would you prefer as the person being asked?
Probably the first one.
Right? Because even though this person is, it seems harmless and like, I would really like it, but you do what you want. It really does add a subtle amount of pressure of, well, I already know what they want, right? They didn't even wait for me to tell them what I want. They've already added their layer of, it would be cool, but you'd let me know, right? And it adds that extra bit of pressure to not stay true to yourself and go, I really don't feel comfortable, right? And so not adding your agenda is really important when asking for consent.
Yeah. And so much too, this is about like tone of voice too, right?
Yeah.
If someone is just like, for example, if you're like watching a movie and making out and the person wants to take it to the next level and they're like, well, do you want to move it to the bedroom? And then, the person's like, not sure. And they're like, oh, come on, I really think that we should do, and that like you were saying, it's that manipulation, that pressure, right? Whereas if you phrase it as like, hey, do you want to move into the bedroom and maybe take this up a notch, or do you want to keep watching the movie, right? You're giving them the option of, do you want to keep watching the movie? And so it's much easier to be able to pick that option if it's presented to you, right?
Yeah.
And I totally stole that example from Nicole. I've heard her give that before. And really on.
I couldn't think of it. You came in clutch. Thank you for that. And last but not least, respecting each other's choices, right? That is, asking for consent is the first step, but then accepting whether that person is giving you the consent or not is just as important, right? There's no point in asking if we're not going to respect what we hear, right? So very much, paying attention to their body language, to whether that response sounds iffy or not, and just very much respecting that other person's choice. And if they're comfortable enough to tell you, hey, I don't feel comfortable doing that, it's not about you, it's about that experience, it's about, what they're comfortable with, and, just saying, okay, not a problem, and moving on. And actually, before I get too far into that, we do have a couple of examples of how to ask and how to maybe take rejection if that does happen.
Absolutely. Right. So a lot of times when we talk about consent, I would say, especially like when we go to high schools and talk about it, a lot of times there's this sense that like, well, asking for consent, like that's so awkward. It's going to kill the mood. Like, how do I even say it? Like, and so there are a lot of different ways, right? It can depend on your personality. Again, that level of relationship you have with the other person. But here are just some examples, right? And what I love too about that handout I was mentioning with the what makes a healthy sexual experience, under each of the 4 categories, there are examples of how to ask about that specific category, right? So you can ask, someone, do you want to do X, Y, and Z? What do you want me to do to you? Do you want to do this sexual, and then that's what sounds awkward is, do you want to do this sexual activity? It's like, you'll find a way. It can be more like, do you want to, are you down to do this? You'll find a way to say it in your own words, right?
Yeah.
Can I do this, or can we do this? And then finally asking things like, are you sober enough for this, right? And we've touched on it a little bit, right? But if someone has had too much to drink, or they have taken drugs and they're not coherent, they don't understand what's going on, you don't think they're going to remember it the next day, that is not the space where consent is possible, right? You know,
Right.
in order for there to be consent, people have to have a clear understanding of what's going on, and they have to be able to, in their conscious mind, be saying yes, right? And oftentimes people who are under the influence of alcohol, if they're just kind of going along with it, they seem really confused, they seem really out of it, then that's not a signal to keep going, right? And so
Yeah.
we want to be having that conversation with, are you sober enough for this? And paying attention to those nonverbals, right? Because someone
Yeah.
who is super drunk might think, oh yeah, I'm fine. Like, you know, there have been situations where someone's like, oh, you know, give me my keys, I'm fine to drive. And you're like, okay, clearly you're not going to be driving away, right? So we also want to be taking into account not only what is that person saying, but also what are their nonverbals? You know, do they seem comfortable? Do they seem sober? Do they seem like they understand what's going on? And so it takes a lot of critical thinking skills to, in that moment, be able to make that determination. So it's important to keep that in the front of your mind as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much for getting into that. It's very important because we do tend to see, you know, I mean, people hook up when alcohol and drugs are involved, and it's important to understand, you know, that the difference there of getting a sober yes. And so, what if, you know, we don't live in an ideal world, right, where we're going to have a very clear yes and a very clear no, right? We wish it was that black and white, but so what happens in those instances when you don't when you hear something other than an enthusiastic yes or an enthusiastic no, right? That gray area. So some things here that we've offered, that we've had, you know, that again, make it your own, like Sabrina had said, you know, these are just very baseline responses, but make it your own. So if you don't hear a yes, you hear an or a sure, or what we hear often is like, well, if you want to, right, where that responsibility is now being taken off of that person and it's given back, and no, you really want to hear what this person wants. So you hear anything that's not a yes, right, or that, you know, that's like an enthusiastic one, and you go, okay, no, let's wait. If you're not sure, you know, I don't want to do anything that you're not ready for. I don't want to do anything that you're not into. And then lastly, you know, maybe saying like, that's okay. Make sure that that person understands that you are more than willing to respect their response, right? We don't want them to feel bad about being honest about what they want, right? So that's okay. No worries. Would you like to do something else instead? So giving that other option, or would you like to continue watching the movie instead? Or, you know, whatever it is, fill in the blank here. Make it known to that person that just because you're not going to continue in that sexual activity, that, you know, the night's over, it's ruined. It's definitely not the case, right? Sex is not an obligation in a relationship, however you define that relationship. So telling them, no, not a problem. Let's do this other fun activity instead. That way they understand that, you know, it's not obligatory. It's not ruining the mood. We're just going to do something else.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And as we've been talking about, you know, consent is a necessary part of a sexual experience. And in an ideal world, everyone would feel comfortable asking for consent and giving consent. But that can be really difficult, especially, I think, you know, we live in like a really interesting time in 2021 where it's like still kind of taboo to talk about sex. And like there are some people that are in our country that are getting like comprehensive sex ed, and then there are other people who are still not having these conversations at all.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, in a lot of the media we're consuming, it is getting, you know, graphically more sexual, and like that can be really empowering or it can be exploitative. But regardless, it can send a lot of mixed messages. And we're trying, especially when we're young, you know, we're trying to learn about sex from all of these different sources, you know, whether that be online pornography, or, you know, the movies that we're watching, the music videos that we're seeing, the music that we're listening to. And it can be very confusing about what we're absorbing without having frank conversations about what is consent, about what is a healthy sexual experience. And so that's really the world that we're trying to get to. And it's also important to note too, that when we say everyone should feel comfortable asking for and giving consent, is also understanding the way that a lot of times our gender is socialized. You know, when we grow up, if we're determined to be a boy, and then we grow into being a man, a lot of times there is pressure that, oh, well, you should be the one always asking the person out. Typically, there's this idea that, oh, you're a guy, so you're gonna like girls. And there's this idea that, oh, well, you should ask the girl out, you should make the first move, you should be kind of the aggressor in the situation, right?
Yes.
But that faces a couple of problems. One, in that, like, not every guy is going to be heterosexual and interested in women, right? So that's also exclusive on that front. And then also, in reality, like we said, everyone should feel comfortable asking for and giving consent, right?
Yeah.
And so really anyone of any gender should feel empowered to feel like it's okay to ask these questions, to make moves on someone else if they're comfortable with it. And then everyone should feel empowered to be able to say yes or no. Unfortunately, this isn't yet the world that we're in, but I think that that's such a big, important piece of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, is really talking about these things and being able to try and build that consent culture so people understand what consent is and that they're allowed to talk about it, and that they are really, we're striving for this in all of our sexual experiences.
Yep. Yep. Thank you so much. Yeah, we want everybody to do it. We like breaking down gender norms, switch it up and allow everyone to feel like they have the power to be the asking person, right? And not always that passive role.
Yeah.
And so,
and before, actually, I had a thought too, is also it's important to note that, like, consent is a skill, right? And so it's something that you learn. So especially if we maybe aren't having these frank conversations, or whatever the case may be, it's not something that we come out of the womb knowing how to do, right?
It's not something we're taught in school.
Yeah. So it's something that it will take practice. And yes, it might feel kind of like a little bumbly and a little maybe robotic when you first start asking for consent, but that's part of getting more comfortable as a sexual being, is being able to get more comfortable asking for consent, talking about what we're interested in, talking about what we want and our boundaries. But it gets easier and easier as you practice. So I also wanted to note that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. It is a skill. It will get easier. And, taking that another step further, I'm sure by now that by everything that we've been saying, consent, it's necessary. It's another thing is that a victim is never ever at fault for a sexual assault, right? It doesn't matter what that person was wearing. It doesn't matter if they were under the influence of alcohol or drugs. It doesn't matter if the two people are dating, or if they were kissing, or if sex had even happened in the past in their relationship. And, we realize, consent is an ongoing conversation. It's not always a given. And then unfortunately, something happens. Just because they'd had sex in the past does not mean that it was the victim's fault this time. So being afraid to say no is not giving consent, right? The fault always lies with the person who's causing the harm, that perpetrator. And that's why it's important during SAM, Sexual Assault Awareness Month, to talk about, changing that idea of, of breaking those gender norms of who should ask and who should give consent. And, that idea that person brought it upon themselves because they were wearing a bikini or because they were flirting with a certain person, right? So it's not just about, I love that we're teaching about consent, about how to ask it, and, why it's so important, but we also have to take it a step further and kind of put this into real world perspectives and, apply it to our life. And at times, we do read and hear victim blaming statements like, oh, well, yeah, but, they were asking for it, or, oh, they've hooked up with people in the past. Somebody's past sexual history does not constitute, them being at fault for sexual assault in the future. It's, like I said, at the bottom line, it really never, ever is the victim's fault. The harm is always lies, or the cause, the blame always lies with the perpetrator. And I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that, Sabrina, but that's just something that, we feel very, very passionately about here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, the only thing I would add is that, as we've been talking about, there are literally so many scenarios where sexual assault happens, right? Where it's within relationships, it might be between strangers, it might be within a family, it might be, it happening in a workplace. There are so many scenarios where sexual assault happens, but the only constant is that one person is choosing to hurt someone else, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so all of the excuses that people make up of like, oh, well, this victim deserved it or was asking for it, it makes no sense, because again, there are so many scenarios where sexual assault happens, and so it's always important to be putting that responsibility and that blame on the person who's causing harm.
Yep. Yeah. And, it's really hard. There's so many different obstacles, whether it be, embarrassment or shame or guilt. Not that those feelings are valid, but unfortunately, the society that we do live in at this point, that it's changing slowly, but there is a really harsh reality that when victims or survivors want to come forward, that there are obstacles to doing that, whether it be a fear of not being believed, whether it be a fear of being blamed, right? Like we're just talking about, even just, garnering up the courage to speak out against your perpetrator because they are a friend or a member of the family. There are so many obstacles that come in the way of somebody, you know, saying like, hey, I've been assaulted, that when they do come forward, it's really important for us to, to listen and to support and to believe these survivors, because there is a lot more harm, unfortunately, that comes from it than good. And so we wanted to share with you just some tweets, the hashtag why I didn't report hashtag that was going around a couple of years ago. Wanted to share one, so you want to bring one up, Sabrina. We wanted to just give you some real world instances of why people didn't report, why they didn't come forward, right? So this first one here, it's why I didn't report, because he was my boyfriend, a person I was supposed to trust. And he asked me if I was okay after he did it. He made me think it was normal. And unfortunately, like we've mentioned, this is not something we learn, that everybody has the privilege to learn about, right? Even in comprehensive sex ed, we might not understand that, that it can happen between partners, right? Or, that it's not okay to feel pressured into it, whether it be by somebody, even if it's somebody we know and love that we're supposed to trust. And so it's important to just kind of break down like why it is that people didn't come forward, and making sure that we attack those myths head on.
Absolutely. The next tweet we have, it says, why I didn't report my sexual assault. I was living in a time when someone who identified as a gay teenager would not be taken seriously by the police. I believed that I would be mocked and ridiculed for being gay. I also felt it was my fault. I didn't think they would believe me. So exactly what Nicole was saying in terms of the fear of not being believed, as well as this person mentioned, going back to the idea around those who are more marginalized being more vulnerable. I think our society is making slow but steady progress. But there is still a lot of fear around someone's identity, meaning that they're not going to be taken seriously, or that they're going to be blamed. Or maybe, for example, I don't know this person's situation, but maybe also they hadn't yet come out as being gay to their family or to their peer circle, right? And so then there's this difficult decision a survivor has to make, where it's like, well, if I do want to report what happened, does that mean then outing myself to everyone? And so then, and that might not be the safest decision for that survivor. And so that can be something that keeps them silent as well. So I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, the different layers that a survivor has to sometimes reckon with beyond just the sexual assault, which is already traumatizing enough.
Exactly, just an extra added layer. And we don't have a tweet about this, but you saying that, which one is the worst, right? Coming out or speaking up about your an assault that happened to you. The same thing we talked about earlier about how violence is disproportionately, on marginalized communities, right? So, LGBTQ a community, and BIPOC, Black and Indigenous people of color, they might also have a fear of going to the police, right? Is reporting my assault important enough for me to deal with, maybe people that we don't trust, right? And so that's just another added layer. And so we can go on to the next one. And this one says, why I didn't report. The person I told the morning after it happened said, don't be naive. What did you think was going to happen? So I stopped calling it rape and I started calling myself names instead. So this goes back to that idea of, well, what did you expect was going to happen? You were hooking up with that person. You went on a date with that person. And there's this notion that, if you bring somebody into your bedroom, if you go out with them, that there's this expectation that there will be sex at the end of that. And that's not the case. Having somebody come up to your room means just that, right? That and making sure that we get that consent for everything ongoing after that, and not just assuming that as soon as you're in somebody's room, all bets are off. That's just absolutely not the case.
Yeah. And finally, we have a tweet that uses the hashtag why I didn't report, but they said, I did. It didn't matter. I was dismissed, disparaged, and I still get blamed. So that's really what we're trying to work on, right? Is this culture where people have a fear of not being believed. And even when they do, backlash they might get of being dismissed or made fun of or blamed about what happens, which just adds on to the trauma that someone's already experienced, right? And so if you're interested, this hashtag has a ton of different responses all over Twitter that you can continue to read about why folks didn't report. And so if you are in the space to do that, I would highly recommend you check that out and bear witness to more of these survivor stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Really puts things into perspective.
Absolutely. So how can we advocate for survivors during SAM, right? How do we change this culture where survivors are either left in silence or when they do come forward, they are disparaged or blamed? There's really three things that folks can do. This month, we're asking you to educate your friends or family, maybe share this video if that feels like a good option to you, or check out any of those handouts that we have in the Google folder that's linked in the description. Share a handout with someone that start that conversation with them. Let them know that victim blaming is not okay. It's illogical and it hurts survivors. The other thing you can do is intervene when you hear or see something, whether that's you hear someone being blamed as the victim, or maybe you see or hear some type of harassment going on, or an instance that you feel might turn violent. What can we do to safely be active bystanders in that situation? There is a handout about that in our Google folder. We did want to keep it to the 101, so we didn't want to get too deep into anything, but I also would invite you to come to our Waymakers Sexual Assault Victim Services open house. That's going to be on April 6th at 6 p.m. We are going to be talking about bystander intervention. How can we step up and intervene, whether it's being direct, creating a distraction, delegating to someone in authority, or teaming up with a friend to intervene in the situation. And we'll also be talking about what is the appropriate thing to say if someone does come forward and expresses a sexual assault or a sexual harassment or sexual abuse that they've been through. What can you say to really support that person? So that will all be covered at our virtual open house, which I would highly encourage you to come to Tuesday, April 6th at 6 p.m. And then finally, we would encourage you to follow us on social media. We're going to be posting stuff throughout the month and all year long. As the Rape Crisis Center for Orange County, we are always talking about these conversations about how we can support survivors, how we can prevent assault, how we can make consent and equity a normal and expected part of our society. So you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, as well as TikTok at SAVS Waymakers OC. So SAVS as in Sexual Assault Victim Services, Waymakers OC. And so those will also be linked in the description for you to check out.
And not to toot our own horn, but I really do love our social media. We take this, I don't know if you felt it here, but like that approach of, everybody has to start somewhere. We got to learn, right? Like it's just positive, support survivors, support education. And and we really do reflect that in our social media. So if you'd like to, follow and share whatever it is that speaks to you there and keep that sexual assault movement moving forward. I know it sounds cheesy, but Sabrina and I do tell people, you can be that one person that starts that ripple. And then, you call out your friend for something, or you share something positive and they share it and they continue to share it. It really does have a ripple effect, and we can continue to fight against sexual assault in April and the rest of the year. So this slide will look familiar. We did have it at the beginning, but just it's never enough, right? So just really, again, trying to share our hotline. It is free. It is confidential. It is what I didn't mention before is that it's not just for survivors, right? If you have a partner that was a survivor of sexual assault and you want to know, what can I do? What are some resources I can give to my loved one? Whether that be a partner, a friend, a family member, call them and you can get those resources. You can go on to our handout, our resource folder, and find out there too. But the advocates on the other line, on the other end of that line, are wonderful. And again, if talking on the phone is not your thing, rain with 2ns.org. There's a chat there. It is also free. It is also confidential, and it is also 24/7. So that is always there for you, either one of those.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole. And especially, after this conversation, once we end this presentation, if, those feelings are still, if feelings are coming up and the material is still sticking with you in a way that feels overwhelming, please feel free to access those resources for sure. And then lastly, we wanted to invite you to some of our other events that we have going on. So I just mentioned that we have our virtual open house, which is going to be April 6th, starting at 6 p.m. We're going to have some history lessons about common sexual assault awareness months month events that we would be doing if we were not still following the safety social distancing guidelines, but in past years, different events that we utilized during SAM to raise awareness and start these conversations. We're also going to be having a few survivors sharing their stories. Some of Waymakers clients are going to be graciously welcomed onto the stream live. We're going to have also some written statements from survivors to really speak truth to what is happening in Orange County and the experiences that folks are going through. Similar to how we have this pre-recorded presentation, the next week, so April 9th through 16th, there's going to be another presentation available that our advocates put together called Bodies and Boundaries, Parenting for a Consent Culture. That is all about how can we raise the next generation to understand consent, bodily autonomy, and prevent child sexual abuse. Also on April 16th, we're going to be launching our virtual clothesline project. So if you're not aware of what the clothesline project is, basically it's an art display where shirts are hung up on clotheslines. Each shirt color represents a different type of violence, and survivors as well as their loved ones create these t-shirts as a sense of catharsis to express what they've been through, whether it be messages of hope, their written narrative, anger, sadness, whatever it is. Survivors and their loved ones are encouraged to put it on a shirt. And then typically we display it at colleges and universities all across Orange County throughout the month of April. But obviously we cannot do that this year. So we're going to have a great virtual clothesline project that's going to be available as an interactive presentation, as a YouTube video, as well as an IGTV. Another reason to follow our Instagram.
Yeah. And I feel like out of all of the events that we put on in SAM, that is the one that just hits the most people in the feels, whether it's because they have the chance to, like Sabrina said, like release, what has happened to them specifically, write it down, let it go, and know that other people all throughout Orange County are going to see it, or whether it's just going and reading all of them and just really like taking that time to, process the fact that this is such a wide ranging and unfortunately something that does happen often. When you see the visual representation of all of those shirts hung up across the school, and I mean, we take up so much space, you just go, this isn't something that just happens once in a while. It really does give you that feeling of, wow, that it's just unfortunately just happens way too much. So I'm glad that we were able to still bring that, the clothesline out in during this month.
Absolutely. That will be available starting the 16th through the end of the month. And our other live event that's going to be happening this year is on April 23rd. We're going to be having an Instagram live. So details are going to come out about that soon. But another reason to follow our Instagram, we're going to have a conversation in the morning and talk about Sexual Assault Awareness Month through Instagram. And then finally, one of our favorite days in April is Denim Day. So that's going to be April 28th. So we mentioned, I think at the beginning of the presentation, both the photos that Nicole and I had on our slides were from Denim Days in years past. But Denim Day is such an important, powerful day. And if you go to denimdayinfo.org, it really has all of the information of why we wear denim. It has to do with a court case that was in Italy in the 90s, where essentially a victim was sexually assaulted. And then originally the person who committed the sexual assault was arrested and convicted. But then upon appeal, initially the charges were dropped because there was this idea that, oh, well, the victim was wearing very tight jeans, so therefore she couldn't have been assaulted because they were so tight, she must have helped taken them off. And somehow that meant that she had consented and that a sexual assault hadn't happened. So naturally, then the Italian parliament, they all wore their jeans in protest, and then it became kind of this global movement. So now every year on the last Wednesday of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we all wear denim to protest victim blaming, to have those conversations conversations and break a lot of those myths that come around sexual assault, and to show supports for survivors. So we're offering the opportunity to participate again this year. If you want to take a picture of yourself, or if you have other people that are in your germ bubble that you want to take pictures with of you guys wearing denim, you can send those via direct message to our Instagram at Savs Waymakers OC, or email them to prevention@waymakersoc.org. And we're going to be flooding all of our social media pages with Denim Day pictures all day long to protest victim blaming and stand with survivors.
Can't wait.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for tuning into this presentation. I don't know, Nicole, if there's anything else you wanted to add, but so glad we were able to have this conversation. And this is just a 101, so there is so much more information that can be covered. And if you are a part of a club, if you are a teacher for a class, if you have a group that you want to bring some more education around this, if there's a topic you want explored more, you can always request a presentation with us too. So you can also email that email prevention@waymakersoc.org. And myself, Nicole, or one of our other staff are always excited to currently doing virtual presentations and to bring this education to more and more folks. So that's an option for you as well.
Yeah. And I just want to say thank you so much for being with us today. And we hope to see you throughout the rest of the month as well, in honor of Sam. Love that.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Have a good day.